There was no press conference, no farewell tour, no statement released to the media, no final interview where they sat together and told the world what was happening. The biggest pop group on the planet, a group that had sold more records than almost anyone in history, simply stopped. One day they were there, and then they weren't. That group was ABBA, and the story of how they ended is unlike any other ending in the history of popular music. Most bands announce when they are done. They hold press conferences. They play farewell concerts in enormous stadiums. They give interviews where they talk about what it all meant, about the memories, about the journey. They give the world a chance to say goodbye. It is the expected thing, the dignified thing, the thing that the music industry has always understood as the proper way to close a chapter. ABBA did none of that. What they did instead was something far stranger, far more human, far more like the music itself. They simply walked away, quietly, without ceremony, without explanation, as if they had decided, somewhere in the private conversations that nobody outside their circle was ever allowed to hear, that the world did not need to be told, that the music would speak for itself, that goodbyes were for people who believed something was actually ending. And perhaps that was the point. Because here is the thing about ABBA's disappearance that nobody in the music industry could explain at the time. It did not feel like an ending. Not to the people who loved the music. Not to the fans who had bought the records and attended the concerts and stood in front of their mirrors singing Dancing Queen into hairbrushes in bedrooms all over the world. It felt like a pause, like a held breath, like something that had stepped back from the light for a moment, but had not gone dark. The last official single ABBA released was called The Day Before You Came. It came out in October 1982. It charted. People bought it. Radio stations played it. And then, nothing. No announcement. No explanation. No next single. Just silence. But here is what makes this silence so extraordinary, so unlike any other silence in pop music history. The silence did not last. Not really. Because ABBA's music kept playing. In homes and cars and shopping centers and wedding receptions and school discos and the quiet private moments when people needed something that felt true. The silence that ABBA left behind was not empty. It was full. Full of everything they had already given the world. And the world, it turned out, was not finished with it yet. What happened in the years after ABBA disappeared is the real story. The story that nobody told at the time. Because at the time, nobody understood what they were watching. Nobody could have known that what looked like an ending was actually something else entirely. Something that had never happened before in the history of popular music. And it began with a silence that refused to stay silent. The music industry has a way of moving on. It is built for moving on. New artists emerge. New sounds take over. New faces appear on the covers of magazines and the fronts of concert halls and the screens of television programs. The industry does not wait. It cannot afford to. There is always something new to sell, always someone new to promote, always a reason to look forward rather than back. And so when ABBA disappeared in 1982, the industry moved on. New bands took their place on the charts. New sounds defined the decade. The synthesizer-driven pop of the mid-1980s made ABBA's lush orchestral productions sound, briefly, like something from another era. A more innocent era, one that the harder-edged cultural moment of the 1980s had decided it no longer needed. But the fans did not move on. That is the part of this story that the music industry did not see coming, could not have seen coming, because it had never happened before in quite this way. ABBA's audience, the people who had loved the music from the beginning, did not transfer their affection to the next thing. They held on to what they had. They played the records. They kept the memories. They passed the music to their children, the way people pass down things that matter. Not as nostalgia, as something alive. And slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. It started in unexpected places, in gay clubs in London and New York and Sydney, where Dancing Queen had always meant something particular, something about joy and defiance and the right to take up space in the world. In karaoke bars, where people who had never performed in public stood up and sang Waterloo and Fernando and Gimme, 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 with a conviction that surprised even themselves. In the quiet moments when The Winner Takes It All came on the radio, and people who had heard it 100 times found themselves pulling over to the side of the road because they could not drive and feel that song at the same time. The music was doing something that ABBA themselves had not planned, something that nobody had planned. It was finding its people. Not the people who had been there from the beginning, though them too, but new people. People who had been children when ABBA was at its peak. People who had not been born yet. People who stumbled across Dancing Queen in a record shop, or heard Fernando through a window, or discovered The Visitors in a box of their parents' old albums, and felt something shift inside them. And here is what none of this looked like from the outside. It did not look like a comeback. It did not look like a revival. It looked like nothing at all. Because it was happening quietly, in private, in the spaces between the things that the music industry was paying attention to. ABBA was not on the charts. ABBA was not on the radio. ABBA was not anywhere that the people who track these things were looking. But ABBA was everywhere that mattered. In 1992, a decade after that last single, a compilation album was released, ABBA Gold. It was not supposed to change anything. It was supposed to be a modest commercial exercise, a collection of hits for people who remembered. What happened instead changed everything. ABBA Gold did not sell modestly. It sold in numbers that the people who released it could not explain. It went to #1. It stayed on the charts for years. It introduced ABBA to people who had never heard of them. It reminded people who thought they had moved on that they had not moved on at all. It did something that almost no album in the history of recorded music has ever done. It proved that ABBA had never really left. And somewhere in Stockholm, 4 people who had said nothing for a decade began to wonder if the silence had been saying something all along. The 4 of them had been living separate lives for a decade, not unhappily, not in the way that people sometimes imagine. 4 musicians sitting in separate rooms, waiting for the phone to ring. They had built things, real things, careers and relationships, and the kind of quiet, ordinary life that fame had always made difficult to hold on to. Björn had thrown himself into work. He always had. The discipline that had made him such an effective songwriter, the ability to sit down at a desk and produce something from nothing, had not left him when ABBA ended. He had projects, he had collaborations, he had the particular restlessness of someone who needs to be making something, and who finds in that making a kind of peace that other things cannot provide. Benny had stayed close to music. He had always been the one most purely defined by it. The piano was not something he did, it was something he was. In the years after ABBA, he had composed, had worked with other artists, had found ways to keep the creative part of himself alive and active and moving forward. The end of ABBA had not ended his relationship with music. Nothing could have done that. Agnetha had done something different. She had pulled back. Not from music entirely, she had released solo albums, but from the relentless public life that ABBA had required of her. She had retreated to the quiet of her home outside Stockholm, to her children, to the private life she had always struggled to protect from the demands of fame. Those who knew her well said she seemed not unhappy, just relieved, as if something that had been pressing on her for years had finally been lifted. And Anni-Frid had gone furthest. She had left Sweden entirely, had built a new life in Europe, in France, in Switzerland, had married again, had found in the distance a kind of freedom that proximity to everything ABBA had meant had never allowed her. She had not abandoned the music, but she had put it somewhere she could look at it, rather than somewhere it could look at her. And then ABBA Gold happened, and everything shifted. Not immediately, not with a phone call between all four of them where they decided something. It was slower than that, quieter, the way things actually happen when real people are involved, rather than the way things happen in the stories that get told about them afterward. It was a gradual realization, a slow understanding, that what they had made together, what they had given the world, had not behaved the way things usually behave when they end. It had grown. Bjorn has spoken about this, about the moment when he understood that ABBA Gold was not just a commercial success, that it was something else, a signal, a message from an audience that had been waiting, patiently, quietly, for longer than anyone had any right to expect. He has said that it changed how he thought about what ABBA was, not what it had been, what it was, present tense. Benny felt it differently. For him it was always about the songs, and the songs were telling him something, that they were not finished, that there was more in them than had yet been found, that the music he and Bjorn had written in those extraordinary years contained possibilities that had not yet been fully explored. But the question that none of them could quite answer, the question that ABBA Gold had raised without resolving, was what came next. Because coming back was not simple. They were not the same people. The world was not the same world. And the particular magic of ABBA, the magic that had made Dancing Queen and The Winner Takes It All and Fernando feel the way they felt, could not simply be reconstructed. It had to be discovered again, differently, in a new form. And that discovery, when it finally came, would arrive from a direction that none of them had expected. From a stage, from a story, from the most unlikely source imaginable. And it would change not just what ABBA was, but what ABBA could be. The stage was in London's West End. The story was called Mamma Mia, and the person who had put it there, after years of trying to convince people that it was possible, was a British producer named Judy Kramer, who had believed in something that most of the music industry had told her was not worth believing in. The idea was simple. Take ABBA's songs, not as a tribute act, not as a nostalgia exercise, but as the emotional backbone of an entirely new story. A story about a young woman who does not know which of three men is her father. A story about love and choice and the complicated inheritance of the lives our parents lived before we were born. A story that used the songs not as artifacts of a particular moment, but as windows into something universal, something that had always been there in the music, waiting to be found. Bjorn and Benny had said yes. It had taken time. It had taken conversations and drafts, and the particular kind of trust that comes from letting someone else interpret something you made. But they had said yes. And in saying yes, they had done something that neither of them fully understood at the time. They had given ABBA a new life, not a replica of the old one, something genuinely new. Mamma Mia opened in 1999. The reviews were mixed. Some critics found it too joyful, too willing to embrace the very qualities that had always made ABBA an easy target, too unguarded, too sincere. In a cultural moment that still valued irony above almost everything else, Mamma Mia's refusal to be ironic about anything felt almost provocative. But the audiences did not care about irony. The audiences came in their thousands, and they stayed, and they came back, and they brought their friends and their mothers and their daughters, and they sang along to songs they had not heard in years, and found that the songs had lost nothing, that the melodies were exactly where they had left them, that Bjorn's words and Benny's music had survived everything. The decade of silence, the critical dismissal, the cultural changes, completely intact. The musical ran for years. Then it became a film, then another film. Then it traveled to Broadway and to stages all over the world. And with every new production, every new audience, every new generation that encountered those songs for the first time in that context, ABBA grew. Not as a memory, as something present, something alive. And then came 2021, 40 years after The Visitors, almost 40 years after that last single. Benny sat down at a piano. Bjorn picked up a pen. And they did something that nobody had asked them to do, that nobody had expected them to do, that many people had long since stopped hoping they would do. They wrote new songs, together, the way they always had, the way they had written Dancing Queen, and The Winner Takes It All, and Fernando, and all the rest. Just two people, a piano, and the particular magic that had always existed between them when they were in the same room working on the same thing. The album was called Voyage. It was released in November 2021. It went to #1 in multiple countries. The concert, performed by digital versions of themselves as they had looked in 1979, sold out in minutes. A new generation discovered ABBA for the first time. An older generation rediscovered what they had never really lost. And somewhere in all of that, in the middle of the sales figures and the streaming numbers and the critical reassessment and the sold-out arena shows, something happened that was more important than any of it. The four of them were in the same room again. They had never said they were done. They had never said goodbye. They had simply stopped. And then, when the time was right, when the music called them back in the way that music sometimes calls people back, they had simply started again. Because some things do not end. They wait. They grow in the silence. They find their way to people who need them through doors that were never fully closed. ABBA never said goodbye, because ABBA never left.